Giant Radish, a retelling of a Russian folk tale. In a wealthy village, in a tidy cottage with a beautiful vegetable garden, lived a grandfather and a grandmother. One spring, the grandfather planted vegetables, including radishes. One morning, as he went into the garden, he saw that one of the radishes had grown huge, as big as a person's head, and even bigger than that. When it turned red and ripe, the grandfather tried to pull the radish out of the ground, grabbing onto its leaves, pulling and pulling, but the radish didn't budge. Then he called for the grandmother. She held onto the grandfather's waist, the grandfather onto the radish, and they pulled and pulled, but it still wouldn't come out. Then they called for their grandchild. The grandchild held onto the grandmother's waist, the grandmother onto the grandfather, and the grandfather onto the radish. Heave ho, heave ho, but the radish, no. The radish wouldn't move. The grandchild then called for his little sister. The little sister held onto the boy onto the grandmother onto the grandfather onto the radish. Heave ho, but the radish, no. Then they thought of the puppy. Woof, woof, little dog, come help us pull out the radish. The puppy grabbed onto the girl's dress, the girl onto the boy onto the grandmother onto the grandfather onto the radish. Heave ho, but the radish, no. Then they thought of the cat. Meow, meow, kitty, kitty, come help us and pull out the radish. The cat grabbed onto the puppy's tail, the puppy onto the girl onto the boy onto the grandmother onto the grandfather onto the radish. Heave ho, but the radish, no. The radish was so stubborn and wouldn't budge at all. Then they thought of the little sheep. Ba, ba, sheep, come help us pull out the radish. The sheep grabbed onto the cat's tail, the cat onto the puppy onto the girl onto the boy onto the grandmother onto the grandfather onto the radish. Heave ho, but the radish, no. Then they thought of the duckling. Quack, quack, duckling, come help us pull out the radish. The duckling grabbed onto the sheep's wool, the sheep onto the cat onto the puppy onto the girl onto the boy onto the grandmother onto the grandfather onto the radish. Heave ho, but the radish, no. Then they thought of the hen. Cluck-a-doodle-doo, come help us and pull out the radish. The hen caught the duck's tail, the duck onto the lamb onto the cat onto the dog onto the girl onto the boy onto the grandmother onto the grandfather onto the radish. Heave ho, but the radish, no. Then they looked around and they remembered there was a little mouse who had made its home in the wall of the house. Squeak, squeak, little mouse, come help us and pull out the radish. The mouse grabbed onto the hen's feather, the hen onto the duck onto the sheep onto the cat onto the puppy onto the girl onto the boy onto the grandma onto the grandpa onto the radish, and heave ho, and the radish go. It came out and they all fell down. They laughed together at their accomplishment and they ate the radish together. Where one alone, it's not enough. With many, strength grows. And even if you're small, you have at least a little strength. And that's the end of the story.